what I want to do this afternoon is, first of all, to make the commitment to you that I'm going to try not to go over 45 minutes. Probably 45 minutes is beyond what a lot of us can absorb, but at least we'll try 45 minutes. We won't, and then we'll see, what comments that you have. What I want to do this afternoon is to read the parable. I haven't been doing this, but I want to read this parable. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, to the crowd, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and I will build larger ones. And there I will store all of my grain and all of my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." About every 50 years, there is kind of a seismic shift in terms of what preachers are taught in terms of sermons. One of those seismic shifts occurred in 1971 when a little-known teacher of preaching by the name of Fred Craddock, he was teaching at Phillips Seminary in Oklahoma, which is the Disciples of Christ. And through the Phillips Publishing House, he published a book called As One Without Authority. It was a small book and for a while virtually unnoticed. Then people began to read the book and see what Fred Craddock was trying to say about a shift in preaching. As one without authority. 100 years ago, if you and I were living and we picked up the New York Times on Monday morning, there would be a copy of a sermon from one of the so-called pulpit giants in New York City. If you open the New York Times today, you will not find a single sermon. Craddock was saying that there was a time, maybe, when preachers simply had authority and people listened to them because they had authority and they were respected. But Craddock said that day is ending. And we're going to have to think about ways in which to engage people. We simply can't stand up in front of people and expect that they are going to listen to us because we are the preacher and we are delivering whatever sermon we're delivering. Craddock said two things that were very powerful about preaching. He said, isn't it interesting that the pastor goes into his or her study, takes the Bible, opens the Bible, whatever commentaries that pastor uses, opens it, and there is a process of excitement and engagement as that minister tries to find what is it that I'm going to say to the congregation on Sunday. Craddock said that too often those of us who are preachers leave the congregation out of that engagement, out of that excitement, out of that experience that we have in the study as we move into the text and try to see what it is that God is saying to us in the text. Can we as preachers, Craddock said, take people on Sunday morning into the process of discovery so that they are discovering themselves what it is that God is saying? Or do we simply come to the congregation to say, I've read the Bible text, I've read the commentaries, I've done the thought on this text, and now I'm going to give you the conclusion? Craddock said, wouldn't it be better if people somehow felt the same kind of engagement, discovery, and excitement that the minister feels as we open the text and we don't know what God is going to say to us? The other thing Craddock said that began to be something that rolled down the hill and a lot of preachers picked up on was that we can't preach in propositions, just in propositions anymore. We all believe that God is love. But Craddock said, if you say that, then think to yourself, what does that look like? Have you ever seen the love of God in your encounters with people, in the living of your lives? Can you come to the pulpit and not only give people a proposition, but also give them a portrait of what it is that you are trying to say? That set preaching on its head, because all of a sudden, those of us who are preachers were thrust into thinking about some different things. That is, how can we put a face on a sermon? What does grace look like? Have you ever seen somebody who was so gracious to you that you walked away from that encounter and you said to yourself, I have seen grace? Have you ever met somebody who seemed to listen to the story of your life in such a way that you felt their love and care for you, and you walked away saying, now that is a portrait of love? That's the reason that the parables are so important in the Gospels. Luke, as I've said to you, is a marvelous preacher. Luke is not a well into which we dip our bucket to try to draw up a little bit of water to preach. Luke is somebody whom we read as somebody who was preaching. Now, we have it in writing, but these stories circulated in an oral way. I want to tell you a story, Jesus said. And he told the story of what we call the rich fool. At the very beginning, I need to tell you that I hit several speed bumps in reading this text. Now, that's not unusual because somebody once said that gratitude is when we have the ability to be surprised. So I opened this parable that I've read before, and I thought to myself, there are several things here that really stand out to me. Jesus is speaking to the crowd. Suddenly, he's interrupted by somebody who says, "Will you please tell my brother to share the inheritance with me?" Now, if the older brother, it was probably the older brother, because when the father died, the oldest son became in charge of what the father had left. So this was probably a younger son saying to Jesus, "Will you please tell my brother to share my inheritance with me?" "Friend," Jesus said, "who made me a judge, an arbiter?" In other words, you're trying to put me into a box that I don't fit. I haven't come to settle legal disputes. Now, what about this younger brother in the crowd? Some people have said that his problem was that he coveted that inheritance. But think about it. If he was really being true and his older brother had not shared the inheritance with him, I think at some point, if I were in his position, I would have asked the same question. But a lot of interpreters of this parable have said that what the younger brother was doing was he was coveting something that wasn't his. Now, I want to go back and look at this in just a minute because I want to take another angle of vision at this question. It is true that coveting fits right in with this story because Jesus is going to be talking about greed and coveting, wanting something that is not ours. But we don't know, do we? Whether this person in the crowd had every legitimate reason to say to Jesus, "Please tell my brother that I deserve a part of this inheritance." You know, another angle of vision as I looked at this and thought to myself, there are some people who may say the right thing at the wrong time. Jesus was preaching. This man interrupted Jesus' preaching with his own request to have a part of the inheritance. Jesus wasn't preaching about greed and covetousness. But this young man, or this man, raised the question, will you tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance? Do you know what I believe one of the deeper things, and as we've talked about, parables can always be seen on the surface, the story as it is. But parables are what we call multivalent. That is, that we have to get beyond the surface of the parable and discover what is the spiritual meaning of this. What is what some people call the symbolic meaning of this? Maybe a part of what was going on was that somebody had interrupted Jesus, may have been saying the very right things, but saying them at the wrong time. Have you ever had the experience of saying something to somebody that you really believed was right, but it turned out to be precisely the wrong time for that person to receive it? I did it in my first student church. Bill Smith and his wife would come into our sanctuary on Sunday morning. They wouldn't sit together. Bill would sit in the back. He sat on the last pew. He always sat and he propped his knee up against the pew in front of him, and he bent down as if he were looking at me, saying, I dare you to say anything that is going to make any difference in my life. I was young. I thought to myself, well, I know what I'll do. I will go over to Bill's house. I'll visit with Bill and we'll become friends in this visit. So went over to Bill and Christine's house. Christine opened the door, big living room with a potbelly stove. Bill's in the back. He was watching championship wrestling from Louisville. Now, folks, I don't know whether I was temporarily out of my mind or why I said what I did. I looked at Bill and I looked at championship wrestling and I said, Bill, you know that's not real, don't you? Now, I really believe it's not real, but I said what I thought was the right thing at precisely the wrong time. Bill didn't say anything to me. I knew I had made a big mistake. You know, a month later, I think he brought it to Diane. He had a garden. He didn't bring it to me. He brought strawberries and lettuce and things out of his garden, almost as if a way of saying that Bill would never say anything about, I appreciate your coming over, or I'm sorry we had this misunderstanding. That just wasn't the way Bill was wired. But I still remember when he gave that gift to Diane, it almost was a way to say to me as a young pastor, you really messed up. And aren't you grateful that there's some people in the world who, even when you mess up, love you in spite of it? I have a friend who has done a lot of interim pastorates. He and I were talking one day and he said, do you know what I've discovered the problem of many churches is? It is control and power. Certain people in the church, now he was not talking about Faith Baptist, he's in Florida, he's talking about churches where he'd been, but he had seen how control and power, saying the wrong things, trying not to be transparent, trying not to say in a kind and caring way. He had seen the damage that had done. And Richard said to me, I'm convinced that the problem with a lot of churches is we have people who have too much ownership of the church and have a way of saying maybe the right things, but at the wrong time. I want to tell you a story, Jesus said. It's a parable about a rich man. By the way, in case you and I think to ourselves that ministers should never talk about material possessions, go back and read the stories of Jesus himself and his own encounters. Jesus talked more about our use of material possessions than he talked about prayer and faith and so many other things that we find no problem in dealing with. For where your treasure is, there is your heart also. He said to his disciples, he said, I want you to travel light. The early church, remember the book of Acts that Luke also wrote? In the second chapter of Acts, what does the early church do? They say, we are going to share our possessions. It's not a question of gripping what we have. It is a question of sharing what we have. What is mine is yours. What is yours is mine. And that's the way the early church began to operate. Jesus said, here's the parable. There is a rich man. He has a lot of goods, a lot of grain. They can't fit into the storage that he has. So he builds bigger barns, and he says to me, now I'm going to relax and eat and drink and be merry. What I want you to notice is that in what the rich man said, how many times he used the first person pronoun. I will do this. I will build bigger barns. This is my stuff. It is, this whole episode is replete with somebody saying, what I have is not a gift. It is mine. What I have is not something that God has given me to possess, to use to help other people. It is mine to build bigger and bigger barns. And over again, if you read that, count up the number of times that I and myself are used when he talks. It's a portrait of somebody whose life needed to be changed. I mean, this is greed. When you and I are at the center of our own lives and everything that we have is just simply ours, can we replace the center of who we are with something or someone beyond ourselves? Can we live life with God at the center of who we are, so that we are not living life by saying, this is mine, I worked hard for it, I earned it, I possess it, I will build bigger barns, I will use it for my own enjoyment. Isn't a part of individual conversion having something changed at the center of our lives? Isn't a part of coming to follow Christ the same way that the early disciples came to follow? Leave what is central to you because you now have another center to your life. I have to confess to you that one of the things I have always been concerned about and probably have become increasingly concerned is that if we are going to change the world, you and I have to be changed by Christ. And it means something that is personal and individual. This man was never going to give his possessions to anybody because he was always at the center of his own life. And it makes me think, in these days where there is so much stress on us, do we have a place, as the Quakers say, of being centered down? Or as the Shaker, the great hymn, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free." Simple Gifts was the name of the song. And turning around, I finally will know the direction I should go. Well, you know the story. He built the bigger barns, but he didn't get to relax. He didn't get to eat and drink and be merry because God came to him and said, in no uncertain terms, "You fool. Tonight your life is going to be taken from you. Tonight will be the end of your life." Now, I want to stay away from a lot of what I grew up on. If you died tonight, do you know where you would spend eternity? I mean, if I heard that question one time, I heard it too many times. But there is something in here about facing my mortality and you're facing your mortality. I don't want to ruin the day. I'm not here to hang crepe on a nice day for you. But folks, the one thing that is true of all of us is that one day we will die. I've done a lot of funerals as a minister. Sometimes easy funerals because somebody had a rich life and it was easy for me to get up to say, this person put Christ at the center of life. But there are times when I have struggled. But One of the things I want to say to you that is a mystery to me, I can't prove it. I've never been there. I don't think heaven is streets of gold. I don't think it's anything like that, but I always go back to Paul. Paul wrote before the Gospels were even written. Probably the first book that we have in the New Testament canon is 1 Thessalonians. And do you know what Paul did in his preaching? There are almost no historical references to the life of Jesus. Where Paul landed in his preaching was, this one whom I follow has died, but he is resurrected. And it was on that Paul built his preaching. So what I have to say to myself, can I prove this in terms of some kind of syllogism? Can I prove it by saying I know everything about what heaven is? No, I can't. And that's probably good, because there is mystery to God. There is mystery. But I have to believe deep in my life that if resurrection was so fundamental to the early church, then resurrection from the dead is fundamental to me as a preacher. He died. And we'll all draw our last breath. And the issue is mystery. I don't know what heaven is like. I know some people that I've met, not any of you, but some people I've met, that I hope I'm not living next to them in heaven. They call themselves Christians, but I, really hope that they're in another neighborhood. If we're living in neighborhoods, I don't know what we're going to live in. I met some people who have no faith at all in the kind of faith that I have, that have communicated in powerful ways the depth of love and care and the concern for other people. I'm not the arbitrator about who goes to heaven. But the man died without ever realizing there could be another center to his life other than himself. So Jesus continues the parable. How are we going to live? Let's take some G words. Well, there's greed and gratitude. Which side? There is grace. There is, I can do it by myself. There is God's grace, unconditional love. The same word in Greek, charis, can mean both thank you and grace. From God's side, it is grace. From our side, it is thank you, God, for giving us a new center to our lives. So Jesus continued in Luke's gospel to talk about living simply. I have a benediction that many of you have heard. I really need to go back and think about this benediction more, because sometimes when I use the benediction, I think to myself, do I really know what I'm saying? My daughter added a line to it. I said, it's my benediction. But it was a good line, so I put it in. Live simply, love generously, care deeply, speak kindly. Here's Laura Beth's line. Listen reverently. Pray daily, and then leave the rest to God. In times like this, that really is the only way that I know how to live.